Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Real Science Exchange, the pubcast where leading scientists and industry professionals meet over a few drinks to discuss the latest ideas and trends in animal nutrition. Hi, I'm Scott Sorrell, one of your hosts here at the Real Science Exchange. Tonight, we're back for the next installment of the Journal Club, styled after the traditional journal clubs convened around the globe, and where we take a closer look at some of the newest research published in the world's leading dairy science journals. We welcome back Dr. Bill Weiss, Emeritus Professor from The Ohio State University, to the pub table once again. Bill selected a paper for tonight's discussion focusing on dietary energy and genomic residual feed intake in bred heifers. To gain additional insight and to liven up the discussion, we've also invited one of the authors to join us. Bill, welcome back to the Real Science Exchange, and thank you for taking on this role as our Journal Club advisor.
Thank you. It's good to be back.
Yeah, it's good to have you back. Before we dive into the paper, what's in your glass tonight, Bill, for the conversation?
Well, I've got a bottle of Moosehead Lager. So,
All right, nice. Any story behind that, or that's just what was in the fridge?
That was what is in the fridge, but this is from graduate school. Norman St. Pierre and I always drank Moosehead in celebration of his Canadian roots. So,
yeah, good. Well, I was going to have a beer tonight, but my son was home for spring break last week, and there's no beer left in the fridge, so we're going back to the bourbon. Also joining us tonight is Dr. Matt Akins from the University of Wisconsin. Welcome to the exchange, Dr. Akins. And in anticipation of spring, do you have anything cool and tasty in your glass?
Thanks for the invitation, Scott. Appreciate it. Good to be here this afternoon. So, yeah, I got a bit of coffee here. So,
nice, tasty, cool coffee. Good. Yeah, very well. Great. We also have Dr. Clay Zimmerman back with us once again tonight. Clay, anything interesting in your glass?
I don't know how interesting it is, but I do have my favorite diet beverage today in my handy thermos.
All right. Good stuff.
Tonight's pubcast stories are brought to you by ReaShure Precision Release Choline. ReaShure is the most researched encapsulated choline on the market today, consistently delivering results to your transition cows of higher peak milk, reduced metabolic disorders, and even in utero benefits to her calf, leading to growth and health improvements. Visit balchem.com to learn more.
All right. Clay, the title of the paper that we're discussing tonight is The Effect of Diet Energy Level and Genomic Residual Feed Intake on Bred Holstein Dairy Heifer Growth and Feed Efficiency. The link for that paper will be in our show notes for our listeners. Clay, can you give us an overview of the paper we're discussing tonight?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting study looking at a number of different factors related to heifer rearing economics and efficiency. So basically, the study was set up to look specifically at bred dairy heifers and the impacts on growth, dry matter intake, and feed efficiency related to genomic residual feed intake, and also looking at two different dietary energy levels, a high energy diet versus a lower energy diet. So pretty interesting paper, looking at all these factors in bred heifers.
Interesting. I look forward to the conversation. Bill, how did you come to select this paper that we'll be reviewing tonight?
Well, one, it's on heifers, and we haven't done anything on heifers. Two, it's a lot of energetics, and that's one of my major interests. So that's the two reasons mainly, is something new and there is a lot on energy. And I also think it's useful to producers, or could be useful to producers.
Mm-hmm. All right, great, thanks. Matt, to get us started, can you tell us a little bit about the Marshfield Research Center where the research took place? And could you also tell us a little bit about the background that went into putting the study together?
Yeah, so the study was conducted at the Marshfield Agriculture Research Station. It's an excellent facility. This study with the bred heifers was conducted in a freestall barn with 16 identical pens. So we had each pen had 8 heifers in it and 8 stalls. Really well designed facility, very comfortable stalls, all in a headlock system as far as feeding, drive-through TMR system where they can very free access. There's very little stress in this facility. So it's an excellent facility as far as comfort, very little stress on these heifers. So, typically we see very good gains of heifers in this facility just because the stalls very comfortable. They don't have a lot of between the bunk and the free stalls. Literally, it's a 10-15 foot walk. So the amount of activity that they generally see in these facilities is a bit less than you might see in a typical free stall or even a bedded pack facility. Just the size of the pens are quite a bit smaller than you might have in a commercial facility, which is pretty interesting to see. But excellent facility. Yeah, so the study was conducted in actually 2015. Kind of brainstormed ideas between Kent Weigel, another co-author on the paper, and Pat Hoffman and Wayne Koblenz. Kind of bouncing around ideas on, hey, we got a lot of this genomic residual feed intake data that we can access or predict on pretty much all of our animals are all genomic tested in the UW-Madison dairy herd, so we can get this information fairly easily. So, and then we wanted to look at, so we can get this information, but we wanted to put a dietary kind of factor in this. And one thing that we've been looking at fairly closely is especially energetics and energy intake on dairy heifers. And really what we're trying to do with a lot of our studies is just trying to control it. Oftentimes pregnant heifers can become overconditioned fairly quickly. Gains can get a bit out of control, especially on higher corn silage diets. So a lot of times we try to dilute the energy using some kind of lower energy forage, whether it's straw or corn stover or other low energy, lower quality hay. There's lots of different options. So we wanted to look at kind of how those two factors interact, the genomic RFI and then the energy content of the diet. So that's kind of what our thought process was.
So Matt, maybe for the benefit of our listeners, could you briefly explain what RFI is?
So RFI stands for residual feed intake. And I'm not an expert, to be honest. I haven't actually done RFI calculations. But the premise is, it's really the difference between the actual energy intake and the expected, what you would predict based on equations. So if it's a negative RFI, that means the animal ate less than predicted. If it's a positive RFI, that means they ate more. So that means they were less efficient. So ideally, we would see animals with a negative RFI prediction.
So Matt, is that during lactation where that gets measured, or can you measure it in these growing heifers as well?
So from our data, it was from lactating cow data, collect over several years of data. So it's fairly difficult in lactating cows because it's a lot of data you got to collect, right? It's intake, body weight and condition score, all the milk yields, milk components. So there's a lot of input factors to be able to calculate energy intake and output. Heifers, it's actually pretty easy. It's just intake and growth, and then body condition score to try to define the different composition of gains. But in this study, it was all based on predictions from lactating cow data. So these RFI calculations were of a predicted as a lactating cow. So we wanted to basically see if we start breeding for cows that have a more efficient or negative RFI, what is that going to do as far as when they're heifers? Is that going to also improve efficiency?
I get on the diets. Well, this was a factorial, and whenever I review papers with factorials, I always ask, obviously you hypothesized an interaction or there's no reason to do a factorial. What was your hypothesis with respect to well, first, I guess for the audience, give a little background on the diets, and then on why you expected an interaction between, low and high efficiency and low and high energy diets.
Yeah. So yeah, good question, Bill. So the diets. So there's a high energy diet. So it's like almost a 50-50 corn silage, alfalfa silage diet. Fairly higher energy. I think the TDN was around 62 or 63% TDN.
63, yeah.
So it's a bit higher than what we balance for. And then the fiber levels were a little bit lower than what we would typically balance for pregnant heifers. It was like 45%. And then we had the lower energy diet, which is more of our optimal gain diet. That was, I think, 58, 59% TDN.
57.
Yeah. And then the NDF was around 50% NDF. And that diet, I think, was about 25% corn silage, 50% alfalfa silage, and then I think about 25% wheat straw, chopped straw.
About 15 on straw was 15. Yeah.
So yeah, that low energy diet would be just a way, and we do this pretty often in our experimental diets, is just trying to use that straw as a way to increase fiber, but also lower energy content to try to really optimize the intakes to where they should be, and also to try to control energy intake. So it's kind of twofold with that lower energy diet, is controlling intake and also lowering the energy intake as well.
So the diets were really only supplemented beyond forages just with mineral in this case, correct?
Exactly. I think, do we have urea in that? We often add urea to these diets.
They were isonitrogenous, but I think you
I don't see urea in the diet. I think the protein came from the alfalfa mostly.
Yeah. So yeah, in that study, the protein in the alfalfa must have been high enough to supplement. Those are pretty low proteins. We're running about 12% protein, which actually is for dairy heifers, pregnant dairy heifers, we found that to be pretty adequate. So the high energy diet was excessive, would cause excessive gains because the lower energy NDF will allow for higher intakes, and also the energy content's higher. So it's going to, both factors really contribute to excess energy intake. As far as the interaction between the diet and RFI level, yeah, we weren't really too sure what we'd expect, I guess. I guess the hypothesis was we would see some sort of, especially with the efficiency, we would see some sort of interaction. We wouldn't expect it as far as if you look at RFI, you might not, it's a bit complicated how it's calculated. So we weren't expecting much of a difference in intakes between those as far as that effect. But we definitely knew we would see something with the diets, just based on our knowledge that higher NDF diets is going to cause a reduction in intake. What we didn't expect was the result of the efficiencies and the gains was really pretty interesting. I don't know if we want to get into the results yet or not, but that was pretty interesting.
So Matt, how long were the heifers actually on these treatment diets?
So they're 4 months, so it's a pretty long period of time, 120 days, so plenty of time to get really good growth data. Kind of the minimum that we do growth data is at least 2 months, about 60 days. Is pretty much the kind of minimum that we like to go, about 8 weeks. To really get decent data. About 120 days is a good chunk of time to get growth data. So.
As someone who doesn't do a lot of heifer diets, you formulated these diets for 0.8 and 1.1 kilograms a gain. How do you actually do that? I mean, I can balance dairy diets in my sleep, but I don't know how you pick. I know you pick the treatments or the desired gains, but then how do you formulate a diet to meet those desired gains?
Uh, yeah, in this case, we used NDF as a way to predict intake. That's probably the hardest thing to do with heifer diets. And that's the one thing we did notice with the NRC model is that it didn't do a great job with predicting intakes for heifers. So what we did in this case is we use NDF. So we assume that heifer is going to eat about 1% of their body weight in NDF per day, which is, if you look at some of the data from Hoffman and Koblenz, that sits pretty nicely, right about 1% of body weight. And that carries true for anything above about 40% NDF diets. If you get below 40%, we've seen it doesn't always actually probably restricted more by energy intake than by NDF, the fill factor. So that's what we did first, was just to predict intakes based on the NDF content of the diet, and then we inputted the body weight and desired gain into the model, and then we balanced the diets based on that. So
just using the estimated either TDN or NEG from the old NRC.
Yeah, from NRC 2001. It actually worked fairly good, especially for, had a pretty good discussion about that in the results. It did miss on a little bit, I think, for the high energy diets.
So Matt, I'm curious. So you're balancing for NDFs, but pretty interesting. When you look at the results, how does NDF digestibility? What role would that play in these heifer diets?
Yeah, that's a good question. We have not looked at that. I've wanted to do that, where you take two corn silages that have identical composition as far as energy or starch, fiber, but the NDF digestibility is maybe higher. I'm using a BMR type corn silage. We haven't done that yet. That's something that would be really interesting, is we haven't really looked at like the direct impact of NDF digestibility on that, because it's kind of, when you use these lower energy, high fiber forages, usually they're pretty low energy NDF digestibility. So you're kind of that's one other factor. That's where you get the lower energy content too. So yeah, that's interesting. What you probably expect is that, similar to lactating cows, you probably see increased intakes. That's what you likely expect, just a faster digestibility, faster digestion of the rumen. It's going to probably allow faster rumen flow. So that's just, without any data, that's what I would figure would happen. That's a good question. I've thought about that several times. So.
Just to put a plug in for the new NRC, it does have NDF in the heifer intake equation now. So,
does it?
So hopefully it will do better than the last one. We knew that was a problem, but we didn't have the data. So the new one does do it. So
I'm glad to hear that, Bill. I actually just got the book today, so I'm gonna get busy reading on that. So.
Okay. Well, if you want to, again, on the big picture here, not on all the detail, but on the major measurements, would you kind of just go over on starting with some of the production measurements, and then I'd like to talk about digestibility a little bit later. But
yeah, so we can start with the intakes, I guess, first. So what we noticed was, for at least dry matter intake, really very little effect of the RFI. So between the high and low RFI, really no effect on intake, or there's no interaction with that.
So Matt, you were feeding for a small amount of feed refusal, correct?
Yeah, and that's what we typically do. We're talking 2-3% of the dry matter offered, and that's what I suggest to producers. When you're feeding these lower energy diets with any kind of roughages in it, if you feed excessive amounts, it's going to cause them to sort. They're going to sort against that lower energy feed stuff, and we've seen that before in some of these trials. That, especially if you get chop sizes too long, even feeding for 2 or 3% refusals, they're still going to sort it out. But by feeding for lower refusals, you're kind of forcing the animals to eat that material. So, but that's typically how we manage that those diets, and it's pretty reasonable. What we basically do is just score the bunks every day before we feed. We're looking for just scattered particles through the bunk. We don't want to see any piles. Sort of like a bunk scoring system for beef cattle. Yeah, but when we look at the intakes, the diet definitely had a pretty major effect. As far as the difference between the high and low energy diets, about a kilo difference. So about 9-10% reduction in intake. So about 2.5 pounds of intake reduction. So, which is what we expect. As far as the NDF intake, that's where kind of if you look at that, that's the really proof right there. It's right around 0.95 to 1% of a body weight intake per day. So right on with what our predictions were.
Yeah, it's amazing. You know, if you look at the kilos of NDF intake, they all ate right at 5 kilos of NDF.
Yeah, that's pretty crazy, isn't it? Yeah, yeah, that was pretty interesting. Very consistent.
Especially it's considering the digestibility of the NDF and those two diets are quite different. And if that was a lactating cow, we would not expect that. We'd expect the straw cows to eat less NDF, and so that to me was quite surprising.
Yeah, I guess it's really interesting with heifers. That's what makes them. They're not too hard to feed, really. They're fairly straightforward compared to a lactating cow, to be honest. So that using NDF as an intake modifier is especially useful, especially for pregnant heifers. That's where it really is useful for pre-breeding animals. It probably may not have as much application, really. So because they don't have this, they're going to be, their fill effects are going to be greater. So you're going to this is probably more of a situation that you'd use for post-breeding your pregnant heifers. So when we start looking at energy intakes, like you'd expect, about a kilo difference in intake, that's going to result in energy intakes are quite a bit higher, about 1.5 kilos of TDN intake greater. So, and that kind of translates directly into what you'd expect for the growth of these animals. But across any of those intake measurements, dry matter or nutrients, we didn't see really any interaction there at all. Very consistent, really no effect of RFI, but definitely a major effect of the diet energy level and especially the diet NDF level. So then if we start looking at performance, so like the growth, that's what in heifers, that's what we mainly look at is growth and also condition, probably the two major factors that we look at. If we look at the daily gains across the 120-day study, we're talking about right about 1.2 kilos of growth for the high energy animals, and those were not different between the high and low or RFI animals on the high energy diet. Right around 1.15 to 1.2. So what is that, about 2.4 pounds per day? Definitely higher than what we would want them to be. So these animals were getting very large by the end of this study. The folks at the farm were like, what are we going to do with these animals after we're done with them? Put them on pasture for a few months just to try to control that growth a little bit more.
Yeah, on the high energy diets, they averaged almost 2.6 pounds a day average daily gain.
Yeah, so we're talking about a half pound more than what we would be targeting. Usually for these larger Holsteins, we're shooting for about 2 pounds per day is what we're to keep up with their growth targets. So
what kind of change in body conditions desirable? Say this was 120 days, so over 3 or 4 months. What kind of body condition score is desirable? Change in body condition score.
We really don't want to see a lot of change in condition. We don't want to see a great amount of gain in condition.
Okay.
Ideally, with heifers, we want to see 3.5 at calving. So
So in this half a unit gain you got is undesirable in those
Oh,
high.
highly undesirable. Yes,
Okay.
these were like finishing animals by the time we got done with them. They were over conditioned greatly, because they started off at like a 3.4 at the start. So those are about between 14 to 16 months when they started.
Yep.
So we don't want to see a great increase if they're already at like a 3.3. We don't want to see them increase by a half point, because that's likely going to lead to difficulties at calving and possibly at excessive fat loss in the early lactation. So we don't want a over-conditioned animal coming into the first lactation.
Did you see any differences in frame score, Matt?
Yeah, so as far as the heights, we didn't see much of a difference in gain of heights across any of the treatments. Any of the hip height growth, really no difference there, which is what we mainly use as our frame score. So really no difference in the frame of the animal, just basically the extra gain was going towards fat gain.
Do these heifers end up down in the Arlington herd at University of Wisconsin?
It depends on it. That's a really interesting question, because it depends on whether they're confirmed pregnant with a bull or a heifer calf. So if they're a bull calf, they're kept at the Marshfield station usually.
Okay.
That's just to keep enough lactating cows in our facility. And then all the animals that are confirmed with a heifer calf are shipped down to the Arlington research facility, because that's where we have all our heifer raising facilities at. So all the heifer calf raising facilities are down there.
Okay.
So that's why there's kind of a difference in where they're raised, or they're calved out.
Okay.
So very rarely will they calve out a bull carrying heifer down at Arlington, just because we can selectively keep them where they're needed. So
I've seen the cows at Arlington. I can attest they are large frame cows.
yes, yeah, yeah. I think I've looked at this a few years ago, looking at the mature body weights. They're large, yeah. They're pretty good range too. We got some animals in third lactation that they're 1,500 pounds to upwards of almost 2,000 pounds. So a vast range in body size of mature cows, which when you're starting to formulate ideas or management for heifers, that makes it a little difficult to try to come up with a mature body weight for the herd. So you just kind of have to take the average of those and use that as a way to predict or kind of figure out what your growth should be in your heifer rearing program. So, but yeah, there's a lot of variation that we see even in the research herd. So, and we use a fairly selective. We're fairly select in our bull, which bulls we use.
Unlike the on this daily gain, what baffled me was with the low energy diet on the high efficient animals, the low RFI high efficient animals, they gain substantially more than what you predicted.
Yeah.
And why do you? Everybody else read the book, but that group didn't. So
yeah, I don't know.
What do you think is the biology behind that? I don't know. I don't know.
Honestly, I don't know either. There's not a lot of literature on it, really, very little. There's some good data from Australia looking at this, where they actually separated out like the top and bottom 10%. And they actually saw a fairly similar result, about a tenth of a kilo difference, and also a reduction in the more efficient animals had lower intakes as well. So it followed their data fairly closely, except for the intake part of it. Yeah, 0.94 kilos for the high efficiency animals compared to 0.85. So about a tenth of a kilo, but so it's about a 0.2 pounds difference. So
more
So
gain for the high efficient animals on that low energy diet. So
so Matt, on the high RFI animals, the ones that would be less efficient on the low energy diet, would you have expected them to eat more than the heifers on the low RFI treatment then?
not necessarily.
Okay.
Not necessarily. What we actually saw is they ate the same amount, but they gained more. So that they were in theory they were still more efficient. It just they were a little as far as how they responded, the genomics responded a little bit different than what we might expect. The RFI is categorized, or theoretically it's the same production but with lower intakes. That's assuming the same body weight, same production, everything, but just a slightly lower intakes. But in this case, we had the same intakes, but a bit higher growth, higher performance out of those heifers. So it's either something metabolically makes them more efficient. We don't really know, to be honest. We didn't take blood samples, liver samples. We didn't really know what was going on inside the animal.
Yeah, so, I find it interesting again that they all, no matter which treatment they were on, they all ate the same kilos of NDF.
Yeah, it works pretty well, doesn't it? Yeah,
It does.
Makes it easy to predict what they're gonna eat. Yeah, that's what I love about using NDF as a intake predictor in heifers. It's beautiful. It really can work really well. So I'm glad that the NRC includes that now, because it's hopefully will help to improve the NDF, the intake predictions. So hopefully, I've seen slowly producers are starting to use that too, using these higher fiber feedstuffs, higher looking at some warm season grasses.
So Matt, how would you compare this strategy for bred heifers compared to limit feeding?
Yeah, they're both good options, right? They both have good qualities to them. So limit feeding, it does take a lot of management, right? So you gotta your diets have to be balanced very well, and you have to be on top of your management as far as dry matter of your feeds, and also monitoring the intakes of those animals and doing body measurements, actually weighing your animals on a routine basis every few months so you can track that, is really important. Because if you're off on that limit feeding program, that can have major effects, whether if you're underfeeding or overfeeding. So it's really really important to manage that, because it's a little less forgiving than with using a high fiber forage system.
So when you are limit feeding, how often do you need to make those adjustments in amount of feed offered?
So that's a good question. So we usually do that. I think at the farm, the Marshfield ARS, they limit feed up there because that's one of the locations they've been doing it for almost 20 years now with Pat Hoffman when he was doing his work up there. So yeah, they typically are going to adjust them every couple months, every month or so. They're going to adjust those intakes. So yeah, but it's hard because you got to think, like, you got to be figuring out, like, what is this animal going to eat, and kind of what they do at the Marshfield station. That's it works really well. And Pat showed this, is that what you should be feeding for is enough feed for them to have enough until. So if we feed at 8 a.m., there should be out of feed by 5 or 6 p.m. So about 10 hours, 10 hours of feed available. If you have feed left the next day, that's obviously you need to ratchet it back. If they're out too early, it kind of you're underfeeding them. So kind of almost an art to it. But Penn State's actually got a nice formulating system on limit feeding. They got a whole system that John Heydrich's developed,
pretty nice formulator based on all their data. And I know Wayne Colvin's used that in one of his feeding studies, and that actually worked really well for him. He was pretty impressed. He'd actually adjust his would be, I think, every 1 or 2 weeks when they're on study, and he would adjust them based on the predicted body weight gains. And he said it worked pretty well. So, but it is a fairly management intense system, because you got to watch your intakes, and also you got to manage the feed bunk really closely. You got to be in there pushing feed up within an hour after you feed. Otherwise, they're going to push that feed away, and then they're going to be stretching for it, and then they're going to lead to shoulder sores and front feet issues. When they're pushing forward, it causes them to wear on the inner claws of their feet, and that's something you got to manage. So you can manage that by pushing it more frequently. So every hour for the first 3 or 4 hours until they get full, and then they'll come back and kind of feed more sporadically. But especially the first few hours, you need to push up more frequently.
I'm assuming on that limit feeding, you got to have plenty of bunk space too, or.
Yep. That's really critical. You need to have a spot at the bunk for every single animal, which in some facilities, as you could imagine, that's probably not the case, especially with heifers, or some of them get pretty overcrowded. So in those situations, limit feeding probably is not a great strategy to go with. So that's kind of where we come up with this. We've been working on this kind of high fiber forage system using an ad-lib intakes. You can feed basically as much as they can eat in a day. It's fairly simple to manage. Just really got to watch NDF, get a good analysis of the feed, so especially NDF protein. But as far as managing the diets, is pretty simple. A bit more simple than with limit feeding. But you still got to go up and push feed up regularly, because they're going to sort through that longer stem material depending on how you have it chopped. So it's not a system that can't go without managing, right? So still has its quirks.
When you formulate these diets I'm going to say you're just limiting energy, but letting them ad lib dry matter intake, but limiting energy, which I think's the right way to do all this stuff. But you expect them to eat less feed, but you had crude protein percent was the same. So I know for research purposes, I know there's reason to do things, but if you expect this diet to reduce intake, would you recommend a higher concentration of crude protein so that intake of protein was the same rather than concentration?
Yeah, that's probably a good point, Bill. Yeah, you probably would have a little bit touch higher protein level in that, so you have the similar protein intakes.
It's obvious you had enough protein because they gained just what you expected, so you weren't limited on protein.
But yeah, you can have a little bit of a safety factor there. Yeah, 11.5%, 12% is kind of on the low end. So maybe you can bump it up to 12.5%, 13%. But yeah, based on the data, we didn't see any difference in growth. It didn't adversely affect them with the lower protein intakes. Actually, if you look at the energy or the protein requirements in NRC, it's right about 9.5%, 10% of the diet protein for heifers. So we can probably 11.5%, 12% for these animals is probably adequate.
So. I don't think so.
Matt, were the results in feed efficiency in your study, were they what you were expecting to see?
Yeah. So similar to the body weight gain, we saw an interaction with these two with the feed efficiency. So yeah, that was really interesting. So really no effect of RFI when they were fed the high energy diet, and I don't know what that's caused by. Why do we see an effect of that? Of the RFI on when they're fed a higher efficiency diet or high energy diet. But when we fed the lower energy diet, we saw that higher gain on the high efficiency animals. yeah, that pulled through and caused they were more efficient compared to the lower efficient animals. So pretty interesting. So really no effect of wasn't an effect of RFI on the high energy diet, but we did see an improvement in feed efficiency when fed the lower energy diet. And I don't know I don't know if it's because they were fed for the optimal gain. That's possibly one reason, or if when they are on the high energy diet that they just were so efficient, gaining so quickly that really there was no effect. There wasn't room for an effect to be more efficient. So it's a kind of a unique thing that we saw with this. So we don't have all the answers with that, so I quite understand why we saw that.
Matt, I'm curious if you looked at economics on the various treatments, and if so, what were your conclusions?
Yeah, we haven't done the economic calculations, but you would expect that the animals that were fed the lower energy diets would be more ideal for at least optimal gain. Those animals on the higher energy diets would be obviously gain more, so they're like, but these are not feedlot animals; they're not beef cattle, so we don't want them to gain that much.
You don't want that
Not,
half a point increase in body condition score.
yeah, if we're in a feedlot situation, we'd be like, oh man, this is great, but I'm like, yeah, not so good. So, but as far as with the lower energy diets, um, they're actually probably more cost effective than if you were to, as far as because those lower energy feeds in normal circumstances would be a bit lower cost. Now, wheat straw, that can get costly, right? We're talking it's more expensive than alfalfa silage some days, but you can find a lot of other lower energy, high fiber forages out there, or grow them.
Matt, do you ever use corn stover in these bred heifer diets to dilute the energy?
Yeah, we have. Wayne Koblitz did a nice study. He actually looked at straw, corn stover, and gamma grass. Gamma grass is a warm season perennial. Corn stover worked really well. The one issue we saw with that is it does they sort it out pretty quickly. So you got to probably grind that to fairly small particle size. But I think it can work. It actually worked. It did its job. It reduced energy intake, or dry matter intake and energy intake. And the body weight gains were almost optimal. They were right around 0.9 kilos, or about right around 2 pounds per day. So compared to an ad libitum fed diet with a higher energy ad lib diet. So yeah, it can work. And most years it's pretty low cost depending on the demand. But there's other good forages out there too. There's sorghums work pretty well with this. Sorghum Sudan grass can work well, especially if it's not a BMR type. Probably wouldn't use a BMR type with this kind of system, but a mature sorghum Sudan grass can work excellent with this. And then most warm season perennials can work excellent too. So switchgrass probably work pretty good. Gamma grass works excellent because it's all leaf material. So there's very little refusal of that. So it works really well. But yeah, there's lots of options. Really, it just comes down to the cost of those and which ones kind of best fit the management style for the farm operation.
Matt, if you looked at the nutrient digestibility of the diet, what did you see there, and were you surprised by any of the findings?
Yeah, really no difference in RFI as we expect. I don't know if we'd expect a difference in digestibility between animals with different RFI or not. Mainly the effects were due to diet, so lower digestibility for the low energy diets. So, which you would expect, right? That higher NDF, especially with that wheat straw in there, it's kind of drags down the NDF digestibility, and then of the total diet dry matter digestibility. So, not too unexpected with that. But yeah, it's pretty interesting.
On beef cattle, but RFI actually started with growing animals, and we kind of usurped it for dairy. But there's been studies that they try to partition the improvements in efficiency, and digestibility is usually credited with a portion of the high. I'll get it mixed up. High efficient animals, low RFI, tend to digest better, but they also tend to produce less heat, and lots of things just add up. So the lack of a difference here, and we're not talking big numbers, so it may have been not enough sensitivity, and those are typically feedlot diets too. So that might be it. But
Yeah, that's a good point.
I do a lot of, for my career, I think I weighed about 150 tons of manure in digestion trials. I figured that up one day.
That's a lot.
It's a lot of manure will be applied.
That individual cows or that
individual cows?
Oh, that's a lot of cows.
And so I look at digestion data a lot, and these look very reasonable, I might add, but approximately organic matter digestibility, if you don't have a lot of fat, is approximately equal to TDN. It's very close. And these TDNs are your OMDs, which I'm going to just say are approximately TDNs, are a lot lower than your estimated TDNs, which doesn't surprise me. But it would also mean that these cows are getting less energy from the diet than you predicted using NRC. Do you think that's, if you would have put in measured energy values, they would have done worse than what NRC would have predicted?
You're saying if you'd have dumped in the digestibility data directly into it.
If you would, again, approximately use OMD as TDN, then calculate energy intakes from that, they'd be a lot less than your energy intakes with the estimated TDNs, which means these cows are doing better energetically than the model predicts. The old model, the new model is a little bit different, but is it, you think that where these cows are better than the heifers are better than we think they are on energy?
Yeah, very likely. Yeah, you see it with cows, right? That genetics play a big role. So wouldn't expect any different with heifers. So, but yeah, I think with the new NRC, I'm looking forward to trying to look and see how that compares to some of our data. So
yeah, if you can't do that, because we didn't have a lot of heifer data, so that'll help too, and just see if there's some deficiencies in the new model.
Yeah, Bill, I was curious if has the data from this paper been run through the new nation?
I have not done it. I doubt it has because of the timing on coming out. I very much doubt, unless somebody's done it since it came out, but it would not have been used in the evaluation. The timing wasn't right.
Yeah. Matt, I was intrigued by how you did your manure collections in this study. Can you describe how the manure collections were done?
A lot of hand shoveling. I'll just explain that. So in that facility, it actually makes it fairly not difficult to do manure collection. We do it on a full pen basis, so it's not just hand grabs, spot sampling like we often would do. That's what we're doing now. But we did whole pen collection. So basically what that means is we take the animals out of the pen, clean the entire pen, remove all the bedding so we don't have bedding contamination. Don't have anything we basically brush off everything off of those, any kind of sand or material off the beds, because that'll increase your ash contamination. And then we put the animals back in. We put dividers between all the pen gates in the alleys to reduce any kind of carryover between pens. And then we take out the automated mechanical scrapers. And then we let the manure accumulate for 2 days. And then we come back 2 days later and shovel it out. Well, luckily we have skid loaders. That works most of the time. But that gets about 75% of it probably. But then the rest we got to hand shovel into the skid loader. So yeah, it works actually fairly well because you're getting everything that the animal excreted.
We've done this in pre-breeding heifers too. In a previous paper that we published, similar design. So yeah, but it's a lot of work compared
Yeah.
to doing spot sampling. But Bill can attest that, yeah, doing a whole pen or full collections is not for the worry.
You're using heifers. You're lucky. They only crap out half as much as a cow. So
yeah, and it's a lot easier. Usually, it's not as liquid as a cow either.
yeah,
so.
that's true.
So it's usually fairly, especially on the low energy diet, it's pretty firm. On the high energy diet, a little bit more loose than of feces. So, but yeah, so then we just measure it. We take collect the manure, sample it, and then take it back to the lab, analyze it for dry matter, ash, NDF protein, and estimate the full excreta of those nutrients. So we got a weight of the manure, the percent of each nutrient. So it's actually pretty unique. Kind of not many other people do that with whole pen collections. So.
So the numbers, the nitrogen with urine, you got to be a little bit careful. What the other numbers look very reasonable. I mean, very reasonable.
Yeah, the nitrogen number, you think about it, you probably get some contamination from the urine. So, yeah. And technically, that would be the nitrogen in the urine was already digested. Yeah. So that's a good point, Bill.
Well, like I said, the dry matter and NDF, all those look very good. I don't have any problems with those at all.
Yeah, it's right around 58% dry matter digestibility for the high energy ones, and about 51% for the lower energy. So about 7 percentage units difference. So yeah, much lower than our TDN calculator.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to plug this through and again just assume, well, the new model doesn't use TDN, so you're gonna have to do a little bit of calculation, but you can get a number.
I'll have to calculate MEs. Yeah.
But again, you have almost a 10 unit difference in vivo fiber digestion, and they ate the same NDF. I just find that very intriguing. Very intriguing.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So,
kind of based on your findings here, Matt, I'm just curious if you've got any follow-up studies planned to kind of fill in some of the blanks.
Yeah, so this was conducted in 2015, so it's a bit of a dated study. We got it published about 4 or 5 years after we got all the data completed after the grad student, Caliana Williams, finished. We actually did a follow-up study in 2016, basically the same design of the study as a Latin square, or not Latin square, but a factorial, 2x2 factorial. Same RFI factors, high and low, and then but instead of that, we did limit feeding versus ad libitum feeding. So we had an ad libitum fed diet, and then we had the same diet that was also limit fed. So we wanted to see if there were similar efficiency differences would happen with that. So that one should be published this year. I got to get that data all wrapped up. So things tend to take a little time for me. So sometimes when you have grad students, it takes especially with an extension appointment, you get kind of pulled in lots of different directions. So I'm sure Bill can attest to that.
So Matt, you monitor these heifers for 150 days into lactation. Once they calved, were there any findings there?
Yeah, really, we didn't see really any differences in lactation performance across any of the treatments. Milk production the same, really no effect there. No difference in fat or protein percentages across the treatments. So obviously those animals that were fed for higher gains, we didn't see much of an effect of a negative effect on lactation performance. So, which you would have thought maybe some effect. I think the thing to take away from is that if you were to keep feeding these animals like that all the way up to calving, we probably would have ran into some problems. But these animals, we typically dry them off, especially heifers are dried off 60 days prior to calving, and they're put onto a lower energy dry cow diet. So similar to what we would feed the rest of the cows.
So that probably helped control gains for those last 60 days. And some of those animals had another 4 or 5 months before calving, so there was some probably effect that might have been diminished between the end of the study and then when they calve. So
Were,
that's something
were
to consider too. So
were there any differences? I'm not sure it was in the paper. Maybe it was. Were there any differences in body weight of these animals at calving, or body condition score?
So I have to look at. I don't think I have that data, because we at the Marshfield location we didn't start taking body weights at calving until this year.
Okay.
So I don't have that data. We do at the Arlington facility. They take body weights within a 1 week after calving, but we don't have that data for Marshfield, so that's why we didn't include it.
Okay.
But the calf body weight was pretty interesting. The ones at the Arlington facility, I think, were generally smaller calf body weights. Obviously, because they're heifers. All the calves were born at Arlington were smaller because they're
Yeah,
heifers.
4.5 kilos.
Yeah, and then all the ones,
pounds.
the calves born in Marshfield were generally larger. They're bull calves. So that's something interesting. It doesn't really follow the treatments, but it's an interesting observation that we had. And we actually had to include location in the model to try to remove some of that variation, just due to location. But yeah, it's interesting that we didn't see a massive, like a negative response due to that really high gains. But again, I think if we had fed that diet all the way up to closer to calving, that we might have seen a more negative effect. So really no effect on dystocia or any of the lactation performance data.
Bill, we've missed any big topics you'd like to cover in the podcast today?
No, I just would like Matt to kind of give a big picture take home on, if I was a producer, what would I do here with using, we realize it's only one experiment, but what can they take home, or a nutrition professional or a producer, what can he take home and apply this to his farm? Because I think there's stuff that's directly applicable today on what you found.
Yeah, so as far as the takeaways from the study, I think the big thing is that the diet energy and the fiber really can be useful to control body weight growth of heifers. So using NDF in the diet to really use that as a control measure for dry matter intake, and then making sure you're balancing properly for the energy content of the diet to meet the needs of heifers. So, but if you know the NDF content of the diet and the body weight of the animals, you can fairly easily predict what the animal's going to eat. So that's kind of the main takeaway from this. We didn't really see a major effect of the RFI. It looks like it's not going to have a negative effect on the animals as far as having a negative RFI, but you might see some response of being more efficient animals. But I think we'll have to get more data on that to really confirm the results. So, but yeah, definitely use of NDF and can be especially useful for feeding dairy heifers, especially pregnant dairy heifers.
To me, this limit feeding is it works, but there's some social issues, some animal welfare concerns, and so this letting the heifers self-limit by feeding high fiber diets, I think, is really a better approach. I realize they're both essentially the same. You're limiting energy intake, but I think this is a easier to apply approach.
Yeah, I completely agree. And probably, if you look at the byproduct markets and protein markets, it's ugly.
Yeah.
To be, feeding a limit feeding diet right now would be pretty costly. If you're starting to put bean meal and even distillers grains, they're pretty costly. Yeah. So I think if you look at the economics, these higher fiber ad lib diets can be fairly effective, and especially economically.
And then, with RFI, I'm sure, I don't follow genetics, but I'm sure more and more people are going to be selecting for RFI on cows. And at the least, like you said, it's not going to affect your decisions on heifer growing. The low energy diets still work just fine on high or low RFI, high efficient animals, which you assume are going to be the ones that most people are selecting for.
Yeah, I think, it's definitely not going to have a major effect on negative. It won't have any implications really on the heifer side. If any, it'll have a positive.
Yeah,
implication.
you may be able to even limit them a little more, throw a little more fiber in that because they still grew more than you expected. And
yeah, a touch more.
Yeah,
a touch more. Yeah, but not anything outside of where we'd be targeting.
Not an issue thing, but you might actually be able to even shave it back, kick a little more fiber in, and shave intake back just a little bit more.
Yeah, if we could really hone in on the groups as far as the genetics of the groups, that's a bit of a challenge on most farms as far as trying to figure out the genetics and the individual groups. That'd be a challenge, I think, on most production farms. So, but across with both groups, it performed well, I think.
Yep.
So Matt, one thing I'm interested in, have you? So I live in Maryland, in the Mid-Atlantic, and we plant a lot of small grains for cover crops here.
Yeah.
Have you all done any research with small grain silages? Because you can adjust your harvest time, and to get a certain NDF level that may work better in these heifer diets.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah. If you start looking at probably that heading to boot stage, heading to dough stage, that'd be pretty almost like ideal forage for inclusion of these heifer diets. The one thing to consider, and you mentioned it earlier, was the NDF data stability.
Right.
Can be pretty high in those cereal grain forages.
Mm-hmm.
But that's probably more work that we got to do to kind of see what effect that NDF data stability has. But yeah, you got a lot of flexibility with those. Wayne Koblenz did a lot of work with triticale here at Marshfield, a pile of work. Really defined really well the kind of change in quality going from vegetative to boot into the reproductive stages. So and basically define anything like boot stage, ideal for lactating cows, kind of that. But anything after that would probably be more directed towards dairy heifers, or would be probably right around that flowering to soft dough or milk stage would be really good quality for dairy heifer diets. So yeah, that's a good point.
So, gentlemen, I don't know if you noticed, but the lights just flickered. That means it's last call, and I'm out of Woodford's. So we best be moving on.
Tonight's last call question is brought to you by Niasure Precision Release Niacin. Niacin is a proven vasodilator for heat stress reduction and a powerful antilipolytic agent for lowering high blood NEFA in transition cows. Protected with Balchem's proprietary encapsulation technology, you can be sure it is being delivered where and when your cows need it. Learn more at balchem.com/Niasure.
Bill, you had a nice kind of wrap up there before. Is there anything else you'd like to add to the kind of closing comments in terms of practical things that people could take home from this conversation today?
Well, again, I'm not a heifer expert by any stretch, but if this is, and from what Matt was saying, I think it is, but if this would work with forages other than straw because of cost, but we have mature grass hay up the wazoo here, and if that would work, it gets good growth rates, the proper growth rates. It doesn't take a lot of management and managing feed bunks and all that when you restrict feed, and it works fine. So I think that's the big thing, is just use what we know on energy intake, fiber intake to get the desired gains rather than artificially restricting feed. But that's my personal opinion. So,
Clay, anything to add? Any key takeaways for you?
I I think they did it. I think both Bill and Matt did a great job summarizing here. I personally prefer this approach of limiting the energy density through increasing fiber over the limit feeding. It is a lot easier to manage in the field, I think. So this is a really interesting paper. So thanks for sharing it with us, Matt.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. And then,
glad it could be useful. So
yeah. Any final words, Matt, you'd like to share with the audience?
yeah, just I don't really have any words, I guess. So if you have questions, you can obviously contact me, the UW. But yeah, I think Bill and Clay's definitely summarized it well. So I don't have much to add, I guess.
All right, very well. Well, we'll put your contact information in the show notes if that's all right.
Yeah.
And that way people can get a hold of you. Perfect. With that, we're going to call it to a close, gentlemen. So I want to thank Bill, Matt, and Clay for sharing this research and for being part of this year's Journal Club. We know that professors and students are using these segments as part of their curriculums, so we appreciate all the hard work that you folks put into these overviews. As always, I also want to thank our loyal audience for joining us here today, once again, around the Real Science Exchange table. Hope you had fun, hope you learned something, and I hope to see you next time here at the Real Science Exchange, where it's always happy hour and you're always among friends.
We'd love to hear your comments or ideas for topics and guests, so please reach out via email to anh.marketing@balchem.com with any suggestions, and we'll work hard to add them to the schedule. Don't forget to leave a 5-star rating on your way out. You can request your Real Science Exchange t-shirt in just a few easy steps. Just like or subscribe to the Real Science Exchange and send us a screenshot along with your address and t-shirt size to anh.marketing@balchem.com. Balchem's Real Science Lecture Series of webinars continues with ruminant-focused topics on the first Tuesday of every month, monogastric-focused topics on the second Tuesday of each month, and quarterly topics for the companion animal segment. Visit balchem.com/realscience to see the latest schedule and to register for upcoming webinars.